Tim Ferriss once said that a person's success in life can usually be measured by the number of uncomfortable conversations that they're willing to have. And I wholeheartedly believe in that. And I think one of the uncomfortable conversations that I've had in my life that's moved the needle and changed the trajectory of my life is to ask for a pay rise. And I think that to ask for a pay rise is so much more than financial. I think what really asking for a pay rise says is um, I believe that I am valuable. I believe that I am worth more than what I'm being rewarded and recognized for. And so, just to give you an example of this, one pivotal moment when I asked for a pay rise was when I first began working in tech. So I'd made a career switch. I went to a boot camp for 4 months full time. I went all in. I'd never done any tech before I started the course. And then I did 4 months full time. And I managed to get a job when I left the course as a technical support engineer. So it was very much an entry level job into the industry. And although I'd done a full stack coding course, although I'd learned how to program and code, that first job was essentially triaging uh, problems that users were having with a software product. And so it was definitely like a step away. It was a step before actually coding. So my job would be to investigate the problem, have a little look around the code to see whether or not I could see what the problem was, or what the issue was for the user, and then create a ticket or a job or a task for the actual developers in the team, and then it would be prioritized, and the developers would then go in and fix the problem with code. And after a few months of working in this role and fulfilling everything that was being asked of me in my remit, there was an opportunity that opened up because one of the software engineers in the team moved and went to another company. And instead of filling that role externally or advertising that role, because we were a nice small knit team, the lead developer turned around to me one lunchtime and said, do you fancy giving it a go? And I was ready. I said, absolutely yes, like 100%. I want to learn. And so I literally moved desks, and it was a very small office anyway, but I literally moved desks to sit next to another developer and to learn from them on the job. And so yeah, for the next couple of months, I did everything that I could to learn a new programming language and to begin to complete work, to fulfill tasks that were being asked of me. And slowly but surely, I became, a fully fledged software developer. And so I suppose I transitioned from this technical support engineer role into a software engineer role in a really great way, whereby, I had, essentially just moved desks, across the office. And there was nothing formal about it. There was no changes of contract or anything like that. It was only a small company. It was a scale-up company. There was certainly no no big announcements or anything like that. It wasn't like a big bang. It was just a very gradual, fluid process. And for me at the time, it was probably the best way that it possibly could have happened. Because when I began as a support engineer, I didn't really have the confidence to go straight into coding. I didn't have confidence in my own ability, and doing it this way gave me that confidence. And the truth is, that's all I really needed. Once I had the confidence, the skill bit was really straightforward. And so yeah, I I had become a software engineer. And so after a year of working with this company, I suppose I'd had about 4 or 5 months as a technical support engineer. And then I'd had 6 to 8 months as a software engineer, all the while maintaining my roles and responsibilities as a technical support engineer. So essentially, nobody else at that point had been brought in to the company to backfill my role as a support engineer or actually replace the software engineer who had moved on to another company. And it was apparent to me that I was now able to give value to the company more so than I had when I first started. And so, I'd started my technical support engineer role with a list of roles and responsibilities. I'd fulfilled those, and then I was now going above and beyond them, and I was beginning to fulfill roles and responsibilities that would be on a software engineer remit. And of course, the software engineers were compensated at a higher level than I had been or that I was as a support engineer. And so it occurred to me that actually there needed to be a conversation because I felt like I was giving the company a great deal of value, and I was not being recognized or rewarded or compensated accordingly for that change. So I'd started at a salary of £26,000 per year as a technical support engineer, and I found myself a year on at the same level, £26,000. But I was fulfilling many of the roles and responsibilities of a software engineer who might have been earning £50,000 a year, £60,000 a year, maybe more. And so one day I just sat down and I thought, actually, what I'd really like to do, just to give myself peace of mind, is to check, like, pull up the job descriptions because, you know, although it's quite crude, that's very much kind of a benchmark in terms of roles and responsibilities. So I pulled up the job description that I had seen when I first applied for my role as support engineer, and then I pulled up a software engineer role for our company, and I just put the two side by side. And so I literally just went with a pen and I just ticked off all of the things that I was doing to make sure that I was satisfying the role that I was initially employed for. And then I looked at the software engineer role and I began to tick off the things that I was now fulfilling on that job description. And I then compiled a list that had all of them together. And I highlighted all of the roles and responsibilities that I had not signed up for that essentially I had not been employed to do. And I thought that actually there was a way in which to quantify this, and I didn't really know what that was. But quite frankly, the game that we play, when we're employed by a company, is that you know we produce work, and the company compensates us with money. That's it. So, armed with this list of all of the roles and responsibilities that I was fulfilling, and highlighting the roles and responsibilities that went above and beyond what I had been originally employed to do at £26,000 a year, I then requested a conversation with the managing director to talk about a pay rise. And I went into that conversation. The managing director knew what the conversation was for, like they knew the purpose of the conversation. And I sat down at a desk and I laid out, what I had done very simply. I gave probably a 90-second opener as to why I wanted to have this conversation, which was the purpose of the conversation, which was that I believe that I deserve a pay rise and I want a pay rise. I then spoke about the that what was at stake, um, and what that was for me was my satisfaction at work. My job satisfaction and how fulfilled I felt. I think how valued I felt as a member of the team. I think whether we like it or not, sometimes our salary can very much reflect how valued we feel, especially compared to our peers. If we feel like we're doing the same things that they are, but they're being compensated at a greater rate, it becomes quite difficult then not to feel resentful. So I laid out the purpose and I laid out the consequences and what I believed was at stake. I also said that obviously with my new skill set and my confidence, that if I were not able to progress with the current company, then there would come a point in the not too distant future whereby I would have to look elsewhere in order to earn more money. And that was also, what was at stake, potentially me leaving the company. I then spoke about how I felt about it, so my own personal feeling, and I was very candid. I said that I hadn't looked at any other jobs and that I didn't want to, that I loved where I was, that I had really enjoyed the process of going from support engineer into software engineer, that I greatly valued the knowledge and the mentorship of the people around me, and how I wanted now to kick on, to level up, to continue to progress with the company, and essentially to flourish and reach my potential. I then spoke about how I wanted to collaborate on this. I spoke about how I wanted to find a way, a compromise, if you will, whereby I felt adequately compensated, but then equally, the firm and the company felt like they were also getting from me um, the the output that they felt was worthy for that level of compensation. And I then kind of brought that together by talking about how I would like to now have a conversation about what that could look like, to ultimately co-design it. And then I stopped talking and I shut up and I sat back and I let the managing director do the talking. And the managing director spoke about how he agreed with what I'd said, how um, he was glad that I'd come to him rather than making, an e-jerk reaction or go and apply somewhere else without talking to him first. And then he also spoke about how, yes, he wanted also to collaborate and kind of co design a solution. And the outcome of that conversation, which was probably no longer than 10 minutes, was that we compromised by agreeing to a pay rise, but it was a conditional pay rise. And so I was sat in that meeting on £26,000 a year, and we we agreed to a £4,000 pay rise to take me to £30,000 a year, which is really where I wanted to be. However, we agreed that we would do that in two stages. That we would increase it to £28,000 for the next 6 months, and then based upon my performance during those 6 months, it would then be increased to £30,000. And I think both of us were extremely happy with the outcome. I think I felt like I'd been heard. I felt like I was being adequately compensated. And so we both agreed on that in that meeting. The MD then later that day, I think, put things into place. And the very next month, I was on that new salary. I fulfilled the 6 months. I went through the performance reviews that we'd agreed on. I passed those performance reviews, and I was then, given another pay rise to £30,000. And so I think that's a good example, coming all the way back round to the Tim Ferriss quote that I mentioned at the beginning. I think that's a really good example about how, our success in life can be measured by the number of uncomfortable conversations that we're willing to have. And I think for me, one thing I don't want to happen is to get to the end of my life and feel like I've left uncomfortable conversations on the table. I would rather have the uncomfortable conversations and maybe not have the outcome that I had hoped for than not to have the uncomfortable conversations at all.